John Garcia, I hope you're having a great afternoon, sir. Welcome into the game in Tuscaloosa.
Good to be on with you, Ryan. How's it going over there?
I'm good. It's just, we're about 2 weeks away from recruits arriving. We've got the SEC spring meetings next week, and we're spending a lot of time recapping and looking ahead.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that, especially, like you said, looking back at a crazy year, basically from all angles, including some unprecedented stuff for Alabama. So we'll see how they defend that, man.
Yeah, and John Parker told us earlier, he said a lot of this time of the year is self-scouting. You look back at what you did wrong, and Nick Saban will find plenty that this team did wrong, and he'll harp that home for hours and hours and hours and weeks and weeks and weeks.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt about it, and I think that's when you create greatness or you foster greatness and you want to create a culture, I should say, you impose that yourself with the hopes that each player begins to do that upon himself to further hyper-locally focus on what he needs to do individually moving forward, and maybe along the way discover, another thing or two that maybe even the coaching staff hadn't brought up. And I think, in college, particularly with these kids, and they're still kids, which, we don't say it enough, you're still growing in a lot of cases. You're still maturing in a lot of cases. So that's why sometimes you see such big strides made from either year one to year two to year three, et cetera.
John, when you look at these players that are going to be arriving here in the next couple of weeks, we spent a lot of time a couple of months ago looking ahead and talking about impact guys, but just spend a couple of minutes here just looking at guys. I know you're high on Patrick Surtain Jr. I think every time I've ever asked you this question, you've always went to Patrick Surtain. But give me a couple of guys that you think, after going through spring practice, that still has a chance to make a big immediate impact in 2018.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong list. I think, the fact that Bama didn't finish number one in the rankings made people think it wasn't a great class. But, per recruit, it was a really strong class, easily averaging more than 4 stars per guy. And some of the elite guys really stand alone, with anybody in the country in any class that Alabama has had. Defensive back was obviously a huge focus. So Patrick Surtain was the headliner there. So obviously he's going to draw his own headlines. But, there's another DB in that group who I think his versatility will help him get on the field. Now, I think he still has a couple of things to accomplish in terms of getting to Alabama that he's really focused on. But Josh Jobe and his skill set, I think, really lends itself to playing early. The guys who play early at Alabama, if they're corners, it's because they're mature, they focus on the ball, and they're physical. If it's safety types, they're making impressions on special teams and perhaps getting into some reserve coverage in the nickel and dime packages. Jobe has experience in both arenas. He was actually originally recruited to play cornerback by Alabama, a guy Nick Saban personally zeroed in on for a very long time, much of which Jobe was committed to Miami. So cornerback was really the focus with him, but he continued to grow, probably about 6'2", 200 pounds right now. So it has made a lot of people think that he's kind of grown into a safety. And, that's really the one position that was lacking outside of quarterback in that class of 2018. Alabama signed 5 defensive backs, and you can make the argument that all 5 are true corners. Well, if there's one guy who maybe isn't as much as the others, it's Josh Jobe. Physically, he's there. He can cover. He can hit. He's mature. He played extremely high-level football in South Florida before a year of prep school up in Connecticut, so he's already well-traveled. He's already gone away from home. All of those things that other freshmen have to assimilate towards, he's kind of already hit. He's already gone through that adversity, and like I said, he's still going through a little bit off of the field right now. So I think if and when he makes it in, it'll be such a sense of normalcy for him that I think it could accelerate his playing time at any one of 2 or 3 positions, potentially in that secondary. Because Ryan, it really does feel like it's all up for grabs in the secondary. I don't know if any one spot is 100% locked in. Maybe Savion Smith, maybe Deontay Thompson, but even then, you just never know. It's not like last year where Minka Fitzpatrick and Ronnie Harrison and Anthony Averett were coming back and you kind of penciled them in. Those pencils that ink or that lead is a little bit lighter than in years past, even with the guys we're familiar with. So I think multiple first-year defensive backs can make not only a solid impact, but maybe even a major one.
I want to take you to Bel Air, Texas, because this player got a lot of recognition when he first signed with Alabama on National Signing Day. But I don't know if we gave him enough, because as we get closer to that arrival point, Jalen Waddle is one of the most anticipated arrivals. Can he really make an impact in that wide receiver room in year number one?
Well, I mean, he plays and has kind of the skill set of a guy who we weren't talking about enough at this time last year. He's kind of like Henry Ruggs, right? In that he's a slippery slot guy with his build, but he can affect special teams, blazing speed, great quickness. The word I always hear when talking about Jalen, whether it's people in Texas, whether it's sources in Tuscaloosa, is explosion. They say this kid, going 0 to 60, there are just few prospects that have come around that can do it as consistently as he does. So that affords you so many things in terms of getting him on the field. It could be something as simple as a bubble screen or a jet sweep or a trick play or, hey, throw him out back there at kick return and see what happens. We've seen Nick Saban trusting first-year guys consistently in the return game. And if there's a candidate on this roster or this class, I should say, there's no doubt that it's Jalen Waddle. And if he's as advanced as a wide receiver prospect like Henry Ruggs was when he arrived, why can't he have the same impact, even though Ruggs and a lot of these other young guys are still on the roster? But even then, like we said with the DBs, we all saw flashes from these guys, but none of them have done it day in, day out, game in, game out just yet. So we know that the best will play at Alabama. So who's to say that when he arrives, Jalen Waddle is not one of the top 3, 4, 5 wide receivers on the roster? In terms of pure explosion and burst, he's maybe top 1, 2, or 3 already without even, having moved in yet.
I want to travel to 2019 here, because as I look right now on your main team rankings, Alabama's pulled out to a pretty comfortable lead at that first place spot. 13 overall commitments, 1 5-star, and 12 4-stars. Alabama's comfortably out front at that number 1 spot in recruiting rankings.
Yeah, and they keep adding guys, right? Friday they added another defensive lineman, another guy who we talk about who can play multiple positions, which is it's like we're saying it too much, but every single guy who's not a quarterback or a special teamer, it seems like he can move around a little bit, and that's what Alabama has long coveted in the recruiting process. And Antonio Alfano out of New Jersey is one of these guys. 6'4", 285, Ryan, but he stands up a lot. You don't see that in high school, especially up in New Jersey. 6'4", 285, you would think he's one of the top, one of the biggest guys or second biggest guy on the team, so you expect him hand in the dirt on the interior. But this guy's not only on the edge, he's standing up at the high school level, and there's conversation that Alabama is coveting him to at least begin his Alabama career doing the same as a jack-type linebacker, which is unbelievable to think about for a kid that size. It tells you all you need to know about his athleticism. It tells you all you need to know about his versatility. And worst-case scenario, you throw 20 pounds on him, and he is a full-time hand-in-the-dirt guy who's still heavily above average in the athleticism department. So he's a dual-threat defensive lineman, if that makes sense. So Bama continues rolling, adds him, beats out Georgia, which is always good for this era, but maybe most impressively beating out Penn State, a school that had recruited New Jersey as well as anybody over the last 5 years. And one of the reasons Bama did it was Josh Gaddis, who actually helped recruit Alfano to Penn State at one point, obviously switched things up when he went down to Tuscaloosa. So it's another notch in the belt for Josh Gaddis, who is getting glowing reviews in year one in Tuscaloosa. So it's number 1 for Bama. They're still rolling, and there's no signs of slowing down. They may even add a kicker this week, and the number 1 rated kicker in the country at that. So that number 1 ranking looks like it's going to be there for quite a while, and there's no there's no reason to think that it might not be number one all the way through. Why not? It's something Alabama's done in the past, and again, with this calendar accelerated, it's going to be something you see more often than not when there's a lot of numbers available. And we've talked about this class; it's going to be over 25. So Bama's going to remain aggressive. They're going to take early commitments, and they're going to continue to recruiting the elite guys all the way through. So there's no reason to think that number one ranking won't be around where they are all the way until February.
Let me go back to Antonio Alfano because we're going to be talking with him a little bit later at 5:30. Josh Gaddis. Yeah, I know he had the connections there working with James Franklin, but what a big steal to get him out of New Jersey and bring him south. As you talked about beating Penn State, beating Georgia, Antonio Alfano coming to Tuscaloosa.
Yeah, that was it's not going to be talked about enough, but Gaddis himself is becoming an ace type of guy. I mean, in this class right now, Brent Key is that guy for Alabama. And a big reason is because Birmingham is so loaded, and the offensive line group in Alabama, in the state, is so loaded. So Brent's got a lot of strong overlaps there. But Gaddis he's really consistent behind him. And I think with Alfano, what's interesting is the NFL is a big part of what he wanted in school. So obviously Alabama was probably going to be a factor with or without Gaddis. But the carryover effect from Penn State is what's interesting here, because he was not his main recruiter while he was at Penn State. But the chatter with Alfano was every time he went to Penn State, which was the school he visited most frequently among the contenders, was that even though Gaddis wasn't his main guy, he basically said something to the effect of you couldn't go visit Penn State when Gaddis was there and not notice and or interact with Josh Gaddis. So this is a guy who's not only focused on grabbing the guys he's assigned, but he's also a good teammate and helping other coaches accomplish their own individual goals. And obviously that helped the transition from Gaddis looking at him as an Alabama coach and kind of helped the Crimson Tide push ahead in a big way once Alfano got on campus and saw more of the same with Gaddis. And then he took over his recruitment and obviously closed the deal ahead of Friday's announcement.
We're talking to John Garcia. He's a national recruiting analyst for 24/7 Sports, BamaOnline.com. John, let me ask you, when you look at this state, where would it rank? Because I know you've been involved with this recruiting process for many, many years. Is this the best you've ever seen in the state of Alabama?
It's a good question. I think in terms of depth and four-star depth, it could be. I think this could be a class where you see, I think right now it's around a dozen. You can see 15 or so 4-stars. I think 17 is the recent high. So that number can be challenged, and it's only May, so there's going to be guys we're not even talking about who we begin talking a lot about. So I think in that regard, this class is as deep at the top as ever. But at the very top, that's where it gets interesting. I looked to, I think it was 2014. You had Marlon Humphrey, you had Rashawn Evans, you had Trey Williams, you had some legit in-state prospects. Rock Thomas was in that class. He was a 5-star at the time. So right off the top of my head, that's 4 5-star prospects in the same class. And the top few, Rashawn Evans and Marlon Humphrey, you're talking top 10 type players in America regardless. So this group has 2 5-stars right now on the offensive line with Clay Webb and Pierce Quick, who is committed to Alabama. That's where it needs to catch up. Get another 5-star or two, and then you can really talk about a historical class. But it's not out of the question. Again, it's only May. We're going to see these kids a lot more as spring wraps up into the summer. I think there's some guys who are 4-stars who might be 5-star candidates if certain things go their way down the line. I think George Pickens, the Hoover wide receiver, every time we see him, he drops our jaws at 6'5", 200 pounds. And I said jaws, by the way. And he's a freakish athlete. I mean, there's nothing more we can say about the kid. I mean, go check my Twitter for a play he made on Saturday where he broke 8 tackles after the catch. You don't see 6'5", 200-pound guys doing that. So he, I think, has a shot at getting that 5th star. A couple of Alabama commitments as well. Both quarterbacks, Talia Tagovailoa, Paul Tyson, can force the issue with a great offseason like we've seen in the past. That's when Tua got his 5th star. That's when Justin Fields and Blake Barnett got their 5th stars. So it's not out of the question there. And then the Auburn commitment at quarterback, same situation. Bo Nix, I think he has a chance as well. He's as consistent and solid and athletic as you'd want a quarterback to be, and I think that will be rewarded at some point. So there's some more five-star candidates that can really make it a juicy conversation. But that 14 group with 2 top 10 prospects in America, I think is really, really hard to beat.
Let me ask you about Clay Webb. What's the process of him making a decision and making that decision public?
He says, and I want to emphasize that, he says that he's going to take the allotment of the process. And he's a guy who's looking to graduate in December, enroll in January at his school of choice. So that would mean a December decision around the early signing period, which is just before Christmas. So in that regards, we've still got, right on the nose of 7 months to go in the Clay Webb sweepstakes. Now, nobody thinks, outside of Clay's own words, that he's going to get it to that point. One, he's not an attention-starved kid. He's been a known name for 2 years, so his main contenders, Alabama, Auburn, and Georgia, have been all over him for the allotment of that time. So he's as familiar as it gets with those 3 programs. He's been a bunch to those schools. His family has gone a bunch to all of those schools, and each of those schools has recruiters that have long recruited him, and maybe more importantly, commitments to those programs that have been heavy on him. We just mentioned Bo Nix. He's all over Clay Webb. They've spent weekends together. Pierce Quick and Paul Tyson, the teammates out of Hewitt-Trussville, they spent spring break with Clay Webb. They're very close. Georgia has multiple commits trying to get him on board. So, and a lot of players trying to get him on board as well. So, he's as familiar as you can be with those 3 programs, Ryan, and with the way he operates, which is very to himself. I'd be surprised if it got all the way to December. I tend to think at the end of the summer, around the start of his senior year, he may wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm ready to end this thing.
John, I want you to take that recruiting hat and I want you to put it to the side for just a couple of seconds, because I always like to pick your brain maybe on 1 or 2 questions away and kind of using the former player perspective. Where do you stand with this grad transfer? Nick Saban is blocking and Brandon Kennedy. He's graduated. He wants to enroll at Auburn or Tennessee. Put the player perspective hat on and maybe help us understand this from your perspective.
Yeah, Ryan, and I apologize if it's loud. We just got rain all of a sudden because that's what the current state of the Southeast is. But, it's a different era. It's something that is new in terms of all these positions. We've seen quarterbacks transferring from the beginning of time in terms of college football, but all of these other positions getting so ahead in academics to where they have 2 years of eligibility, that's still kind of new. So I think that's the fear from the school's perspective is, hey, are we going to just provide a degree and let you go beat us for the next 2 years, potentially? I think that's the fear. You don't want it in state. You certainly don't want it in conference. So you kind of understand Alabama's perspective there. However, times have changed, right? And at some point, you got to go along with it. We saw Alabama eventually budge with Maurice Smith, right or wrong, but again, that was for 1 year, and it wasn't in your division. So you can kind of see the parameters and where Bama will maybe budge a little bit, but you can understand why on this one they're kind of holding their ground, at least right now. But from the player's perspective, Ryan, I think if you've earned a degree, which is not easy, and you think of the players who go out and do it early, that means they're basically in school all year round, including immediately after they graduate high school. They're in that summer 1 session, and they're getting after it. They're not going home for certain breaks and things like that, or they're getting limited breaks, and they're really excelling. A lot of these kids not only have a degree, but they're working on the beginning of their master's after 3 years. So I think there's some merit to that, and there should be a reward for that. Now, we don't want it like free agency. That's the kind of the word that is the scare tactic in college football right now. We don't want it to that extent, but I do think you've kind of earned a freedom. You're obviously 20, 21 years old. You're an adult. You can do everything else legally in this country. So maybe you put more precedent on the merit of a degree, and sometimes 2 degrees where these kids are at, and you give a little bit more flexibility. So maybe I budge a a little more in conference, but maybe not in the division. You know, you kind of like you open another layer of that freedom to move around. So I think there's a compromise there somewhere, and hopefully both parties get to it, because Brandon's a great kid, obviously a smart kid as well, and he's got some ability as a center or guard that other teams covet. So hopefully there's a resolution here soon. But I just don't know. I mean, in-state to your rival, I think that's a lot. I just think that's a lot that anybody can understand. So I understand blocking that one, but maybe cross-divisional things like that, maybe you budge there a little bit, and that's the common ground that Alabama and Brandon Kennedy can find. And that's not scoop. That's just something that I think maybe makes sense as kind of a reward for these guys doing what they have to do off of the field.